to turn to Minister Lametti for his remarks.
Thank you, Chantal. Sego, Kwe, Tansi, hello, et bonjour. Greetings from my office here in Ottawa, which stands on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. And I also acknowledge that my riding, as well as the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal, is in Montreal on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee. But it was also a meeting place for many other First Nations, including the Wendat, Cree, the Anishinaabe, and as well as the Métis peoples. And so we recognize, and of course now as an urban center, has many Indigenous peoples, including not just First Nations, but Inuit and Métis peoples, and the shelter as well. The shelter works with all of them. Thank you, Nagazet, for your leadership and your advocacy. It's an honor to be with you and your team today to share the work that the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal is doing in support of Indigenous women in Montreal. La violence entre les femmes, les filles et les personnes de LGBTQIA+, autochtones au Canada, est une tragédie nationale qui persiste. Nous avons tous un rôle à jouer pour y mettre fin. Le rapport final de l'enquête nationale sur les femmes et les filles autochtones disparues et assassinées expose clairement aux Canadiens et aux Canadiennes la nature et l'ampleur de la violence qui subissent encore les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis. L'enquête met en lumière le racisme systémique et individuel vécu par les femmes, les familles de femmes, de filles et de personnes de LGBTQIA+, autochtones disparus ou assassinés, ainsi que les nombreux obstacles que celles-ci doivent surmonter pour obtenir des services et du soutien. Notre gouvernement demeure déterminé à mettre fin au cycle de la violence et à accroître l'accès à la justice. One way to achieve this is by working together with Indigenous community organizations like the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal. This organization has the expertise, knowledge, and the relationships to help victims of crime, survivors, and their families, providing culturally grounded, trauma-informed assistance. So here's the announcement. Today, I am pleased to announce funding of $300,000 over 3 years to the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal to support their Ishkwe project. This project supports families and communities of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people in Montreal and in the surrounding area. Nagusset will have more to say about it in a minute, but let me just say in general that the project has a number of elements. It's about building relationships across sectors, supporting those at risk of or experiencing violence, helping MMIWG and 2SLGBTQIA+ families gather information and liaise with policing agencies, and developing new tools and working with Montreal Police to improve policies and procedures. The funding today comes from Justice Canada's Victims Fund, which, as part of the broader federal victim strategy, seeks to increase access to justice for victims and survivors of crime and give them a more effective voice in the criminal justice system. L'annonce d'aujourd'hui s'inscrit dans nos efforts continus pour donner suite aux appels à la justice formulés dans le rapport final de l'enquête nationale sur les femmes, les filles autochtones disparues et assassinées. En juin 2021, notre gouvernement a publié la voie fédérale qui représente sa contribution au plan d'action national pour les femmes, les filles et les personnes de LGBTQIA+, autochtones disparus et assassinés. Dans la voie fédérale, le thème de la justice est axé sur la nécessité d'offrir un système de justice plus inclusif et représentatif. Un système qui respecte et protège les peuples autochtones, y compris les femmes, les filles et les personnes de LGBTQIA+. Nous cherchons à accroître notre collaboration avec les partenaires autochtones, provinciaux et territoriaux dans le but d'élargir l'accès à des services et au soutien aux victimes adaptés à la culture dirigés par les Autochtones et tenant compte des traumatismes. Pour ce faire, nous soutenons les unités de liaison pour l'information à l'intention des familles de partout au pays. Ces équipes veillent à ce que les familles et les femmes, des filles et des personnes LGBTQIA+, autochtones, disparues ou assassinées aient accès à l'information, du soutien communautaire et des services aux victimes. Nous travaillons également en partenariat avec les gouvernements, les organisations et les peuples autochtones en vue d'élaborer un plan d'action pour la mise en œuvre de la loi sur la Déclaration des Nations unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones. Cette loi mentionne tout spécialement la nécessité de tenir compte de genre et d'autres formes de diversité. Nous avons déposé le projet de loi C5 qui vise à éliminer certaines peines minimales obligatoires et restrictions relatives aux peines d'emprisonnement avec sursis. Ce dernier pour vraiment améliorer les services et la possibilité d'avoir d'autres formes de peines basées sur les rapports Gladue où on a aussi investi. Enfin, nous poursuivons les discussions et négociations au sujet des ententes sur l'administration de la justice avec les collectivités autochtones de partout au pays. We know that change is possible. Helping organizations like the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal to lead the way forward is a key step. I want to thank them, Nagasette, and all of her team, as well as the many other agencies and advocates across the country for their important work that they do in ensuring access to justice for victims and survivors of crime. Megwich, Niawan, Kenaskumatan. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate the next installment for the next 3 years of $100,000 to the Ishkwe project. So my name is Nagusset. I'm originally from Lac La Ronge, Saskatchewan, Treaty 6. I have been working at the Native Women's Shelter for close to 23 years now. And I always felt like the Native Women's Shelter was that safety net for Indigenous women and children, that they can come here and they would be safe. But because we only have, access to about 23 people at a time, there are still a lot of women that are unable to come to the Native Women's Shelter and that they need additional support. So the Ishkwe project was created in 2017. We wrote our first proposal to Justice Canada, and it was approved. And it has been a really important project because we know that women go missing and murdered, and it's been very well known about what happened in BC. And that oftentimes when Indigenous families went to the police, that they were ignored. And in order to try to create a new project, we needed to hire someone through the Native Women's Shelter who could work with the police and the families directly and to really advocate on behalf when a woman goes missing. And throughout the years since we've had this project, there has been about 57 women that went missing, and I believe we found 56, right? So when we started the project, we received money from the federal. We also received money from the province and through the municipal. So we're working with all 3 different levels of government to be an answer. A couple of years ago, we had additional funding through a private foundation, and now we also have a research coordinator. So this is someone who will be able to go to all the different communities and actually get numbers of what it looks like in Quebec for missing and murdered Indigenous women. So it's a super, super important project. And sometimes when people go to the police office to make an investigation or ask for an investigation, it doesn't necessarily happen. But if you have that advocate and it's someone who actually speaks French as well, then it's more possible for something to happen. So it's really important to have this project. And then sometimes the advocate can also make sure that there's follow-up 24 hours later, because that doesn't always happen either, that the families are supported, that when we find you know, the women that are missing, that we can accompany them to court, that we can offer different services, psychological services, traditional services, whatever it is that they need, and be that first person on the ground. And just recently with the City of Montreal, we established a 1-800 number. Because if you're not comfortable calling the police to say someone went missing, or you have a tip about finding someone, you can call the 1-800 number, and it is, you know, across Canada. So I think that, you know, we have to create our own solutions, and it's really helpful to have support from the federal government to make this happen. And that's all I got to say. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Naguset. We will now begin the question and answer session. A reminder to please virtually raise your hand to indicate that you would like to ask a question. For those of you who are joining us by phone, please press *6 to virtually raise your hand, and then also again to ask your question. Nous allons maintenant amorcer la période de questions et réponses. N'oubliez pas de lever virtuellement la main pour poser votre question. Si vous nous suivez par téléphone, veuillez appuyer sur étoile 6 avant de poser votre question. I will now begin with Olivia Stefanovic, CBC. Please go ahead.
Thank you for taking our questions this morning. Minister Lametti, I have a question for you about getting an update since your government introduced the National Action Plan to address violence against missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I'm wondering if you can tell us what has been accomplished so far. There were calls for a nationwide emergency number, a national task force. What has been accomplished so far, and what will you, what can we expect from the government in the short term in the next few months?
Thanks, Olivia, for the question. The implementation of the federal pathway for the response to the larger national action plan for MMIWG is in the responsibilities of Minister Miller, as we have as the Prime Minister has described in our mandate letters, and I will be acting in a supporting role. I think you can now that the election is over and we're back to work. We've had a couple of detours, as you know, and an ongoing situation in Ukraine that we're dealing with as a government. But I think you can expect from Minister Miller that he's going to push forward with the pathway that was announced by Minister Bennett at the time, and I think you will see progress as we move forward. What you're seeing now, or you're seeing today, or you've seen at other places, is specific announcements that build into that. In this case, this I believe is my second formal announcement with justice parts of that pathway, but certainly other parts will be elaborated by Minister Miller, Minister Haidu in Indigenous Services, Minister Vandal, who's Minister of Northern Affairs. So you'll see it roll out, but it is under the overall coordination and is part of the overall responsibility of Minister Miller.
Thank you. And as a follow-up, I'd just like to turn to this, press release that you put out earlier this week, trying to get the Supreme Court of Canada to appeal this Quebec Court of Appeal decision that found parts of the Indigenous child welfare law unconstitutional. In the meantime, I'm wondering if you can tell us, are any of the agreements that your government is trying to come together with Indigenous communities to strike to reform the child welfare system, are any of these agreements in jeopardy, and what concerns do you have?
Well, thank you for that question, Olivia. It's a very good question. It's a very timely question, and so I'm very pleased to answer it. So let me begin with what I think is the most important part, which is there's been a landmark decision by 5 unanimous judges of the Quebec Court of Appeal saying that old Bill C-92, which was the co-developed federal and Indigenous co-developed legislation to make real what is an obvious point, that Indigenous peoples have an inherent right to take care of their own kids. And so the government of Quebec challenged that with a reference directly to the Quebec Court of Appeal, and the Quebec Court of Appeal resoundingly said that the right to take care of one's own children is part of an inherent right that is part of a larger right to self-determination that Indigenous peoples have under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. That's never been so boldly stated, that's never been so clearly stated, and that's never been so unanimously stated. And so that's a landmark decision. And I think that's important, especially in light of the settlement that we have reached, or we're working on now, reaching the final details with the Caring Society, as part of the solution to a massive problem that we are now trying to compensate for, and which we're trying to correct moving forward, working with Indigenous peoples and following their leadership, because that's the only way this will work, is that if Indigenous peoples are front and center taking care of their own kids. The reason why we're appealing is that there were two provisions that we had co-developed with Indigenous peoples about making the various projects and plans that Indigenous peoples were putting forward to take care of their own children operational by giving it the force of federal law. The court took issue with those points. We feel that those points are important to making the law operational, and so we're appealing that. Now, for the time being, that decision only applies in Quebec, and so we would like to see that ruling on Section 35 apply across Canada, because we think it is a bold and important ruling that needs to be effectively made a precedent across Canada to all courts, and we hope quite sincerely to be able to make the various kinds of programs operational through the two articles that we are supporting in our appeal.
Thank you, Minister. Now, Rob Lurie, CTV. Rob, if you're speaking, maybe you are still muted.
Sorry, there you go. My first question is for Nat Cassette. I just want to know, is this the major source of funding that the Ishpriyu program receives?
No, I receive the exact same amount from a private foundation. So I get two. I have one for the coordinator that actually is the person who receives the call that a woman is missing and she runs out. And then I have a research coordinator who does more about awareness and traveling towards communities to take statistics.
I believe you've been receiving funding from Ottawa for the past 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
But in light of the fact that the cost of living is rising, in light of the fact that you mentioned that you already helped with 56 out of 57 investigations, is this enough funding, or how much more do you need?
I don't know, David, you feeling generous? I mean, basically the funding is pretty much just the salary, and then as well as administrative, right? So and I think when you work in nonprofit, you don't do it for the salary, you do it because you love what you do. So if they were wanting to offer more money, that would be great, but I think that a lot of Montrealers really depend on this project, so we're just really happy to continue providing it. And if we feel there's money's missing, well, I'm going to write a proposal, and I'm sure David will help me with that, right?
I will indeed. Rob, let me just add, there are a variety of different kinds of supports coming through different ministries. So obviously justice and access to justice, helping victims of violence, etc., supporting various justice initiatives are part of that, and the Native Women's Center is accessing part of that today. But there's other programming, in particular through Indigenous Services, now led by Minister Hydru, previously led by Minister Miller, where there are different kinds of supports. We try to cover the needs that are identified. But what is critically important is that groups on the ground, like the Native Women's Shelter, identify those needs and then come forward, because those are the solutions that work the best, the ones that are built from the ground up.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Lametti.
Merci, Rob. Maintenant, je donne la parole à Daniel Leblanc.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur le ministre. J'ai une question sur C5, le projet de loi sur les peines minimales obligatoires. J'aimerais savoir, ça fait longtemps qu'on en parle, d'éliminer des peines minimales obligatoires. Quand est-ce que vous aimeriez que ce projet de loi, quelles sont les intentions avec le processus législatif? Pourquoi est-ce que vous aimeriez les enlever et quand est-ce que vous pensez que ça pourra être fait?
Merci, Daniel, pour la question. D'abord, pourquoi le projet de loi? Parce que les peines minimales, et on propose d'éliminer une vingtaine, ont un impact exagéré sur les peuples autochtones dans le système carcéral, ainsi que les personnes de race noire et les autres personnes racisées. Et c'est statistiquement vrai. Donc, c'est une réalité, c'est une moyenne d'attaquer directement le racisme systémique dans le système judiciaire et carcéral. Donc, c'est très important. J'ai parlé aussi des ordonnances sur sursis, qui est une partie intégrale de ce projet de loi. Ça donne un juge une marge de manœuvre pour trouver d'autres formes de peine, des fois dans la communauté, qui seront, je crois, plus efficaces à guérir et aider les victimes et les personnes de vraiment se reformer ou améliorer leurs conditions. Et ça va très bien avec les investissements dans les rapports GLADU qu'on vient de faire. Et donc, très important, c'est une partie intégrale de la loi. Les peines minimales ne fonctionnent pas. C'est simplement ça. Et créer non seulement une surreprésentation des peuples autochtones dans le système, mais c'est une entrave, ça cause des délais. Donc, on a des questions avec l'arrêt Jordan. La majorité des appels constitutionnels sur la constitutionnalité des articles du Code criminel au Canada, plus que 50%, ce sont des peines minimales qui sont mises en question. Et donc, c'est une entrave pour le système. Et statistiquement, on trouve que ça ne fonctionne pas. Donc, il faut les éliminer. Pour le procès parlementaire, j'aimerais voir, on est arrivé aux deuxième lecture dans la Chambre des communes. J'aimerais le voir débattu aussitôt que possible pour que le projet de loi soit envoyé au comité. Mais honnêtement, j'aimerais le voir la loi en vigueur aussitôt que possible.
Suivi, Daniel?
Non, ça va aller. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Daniel. Prochaine question, Tom Fenario from APTN News.
Hi, this is a question for Minister Lametti. I've actually already had my questions in English answered, so I was wondering if you could just provide a couple questions in French for our weekly news French show. Premièrement, pouvez-vous juste nous donner une mise à jour à propos de l'implémentation de le plan d'action pour femmes disparues et assassinées?
Donc, merci Tom pour la question. Le plan pour les femmes, les filles disparues tombe sur les responsabilités du ministre Miller. Donc, on a élargi notre parti fédéral sous Mme Bennett. Et maintenant, c'est M. Miller qui doit mettre en branle le processus, appuyé évidemment par d'autres ministres comme moi, comme la ministre Haidou et le ministre Vandal. Et je crois que vous allez voir des étapes à suivre avec le ministre Miller.
OK. Et juste à propos, maintenant, Québec fait un appel pour le C92 encore. Est-ce que les... is child welfare on First Nations in Quebec, is it in danger?
Merci encore pour la question parce que c'est une question très importante et effectivement très important, très à jour. Donc, j'aimerais commencer avec la partie la plus importante. On a le projet de loi C-92 qui a été co-développé entre le gouvernement fédéral et le leadership autochtone à travers le Canada pour instaurer un système qui aurait dû être très évident. C'est-à-dire, les peuples autochtones ont un droit inhérent de prendre soin de leurs propres enfants. C'est pas mal évident. Et donc, le projet de loi C-92 a créé un processus pour que les communautés autochtones puissent avoir la possibilité de créer leur propre système, justement, pour prendre soin de leurs enfants. Le gouvernement du Québec a contesté la constitutionnalité de cette loi et la Cour d'appel du Québec a clairement dit, un jugement 5-0, que le droit inhérent de prendre soin de leurs propres enfants faisait partie d'un droit aussi inhérent, mais plus large, de l'autodétermination des peuples autochtones et c'était protégé par l'article 35 de la Constitution. C'était quelque chose qui n'a été jamais dit aussi clairement et aussi directement par un tribunal au Canada. Donc, comme on dit en anglais, it's a landmark. C'est une décision très importante et nous sommes tout à fait d'accord avec cette décision-là. Il y avait deux parties qu'on avait co-développées avec les peuples autochtones pour mettre en œuvre la loi et la Cour d'appel, en donnant ces mesures conçues par les peuples autochtones, ces systèmes conçus par les peuples autochtones, en leur donnant la force de loi fédérale. On pense que c'est important parce que c'est quelque chose qu'on a co-développé avec les peuples autochtones qui est une partie intégrale de la loi. Et donc, on veut avoir la décision de la Cour suprême là-dessus. Mais je crois sincèrement qu'au Québec, la décision fait en sorte que le droit inhérent des peuples autochtones de prendre soin de leurs enfants est maintenant bien ancré dans la loi québécoise.
Merci beaucoup, Ministre Lametti.
Merci.
Merci. There are no more raised hands that I see. So just one last reminder for those who are joining by the phone to press *6. Pour ceux qui nous rejoignent par téléphone, utilisez la fonction étoile 6 pour votre question. Non, ben, cela fait fin à notre conférence de presse. Thank you very much for all of those who have joined us today.